Thank you so much for that great introduction, Gunther. Madam Ambassador, members of the Botstiber Board, members of the public, it's an honor for me to be presenting this annual lecture, and a special honor and a pleasure to be presenting it here at the Austrian Embassy in Washington. I'm going to combine a number of elements in the lecture this evening. It will take you from Woodrow Wilson to the opera Die Frau ohne Schatten to the life of Zita in America. I published a book some years ago that Gunther just mentioned on Woodrow Wilson and the rethinking of Eastern Europe, which of course involved the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire and its replacement by national states on the map. The book that I've published more recently deals with exactly the same moment in history, 1919, that is to say the year of the Paris Peace Conference that ratified the post-war peace and the end of the Habsburg Monarchy, was also the year of the appearance of the opera Die Frau ohne Schatten, and simultaneously the year that the last Habsburg Emperor and Empress went into exile in 1919. So I'm interested in the end of empire and the emergence of an opera in which emperors and empresses are treated as fairy tale figures. And more generally, what the lecture will be about will be how emperors and empresses go from being important political figures in the early 20th century to being the subjects of fairy tale culture as we might imagine them today. I'm going to begin immediately by combining opera and politics. This is Woodrow Wilson at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, the old Metropolitan Opera House, now destroyed. It used to exist at 39th Street and Broadway. I can remember it from when I was a child. Wilson came back from the peace conference to speak from the stage of the Opera House about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The liberated peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and of the Turkish Empire call out to us for the League. The nations that have long been under the heel of the Austrian, that have long cowered before the Germans, that have long suffered the indescribable agonies of being governed by the Turks, have called out to the world generation after generation for justice, for liberation, and for succor. It's a hyperbolic statement of the longings of the nationalities, whom Wilson ventriloquizes in a somewhat operatic manner. I mean to suggest to you that this is an aria in itself, Wilson performing from the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House. One of the things my book is about is how Wilson came to have the ideas that he had about Austria-Hungary and Eastern Europe, some of which were very mistaken, as he himself is supposed to have commented on the way over to Europe in December 1918, 3 million Germans in Bohemia? Masaryk never told me that. The people who informed Wilson about Austria-Hungary and Eastern Europe were a committee called the Inquiry. Many of them were professors, like myself, like members of the Botstiber Board, who tried to give Wilson the best possible knowledge that he could have of the region. When Wilson actually comes to the end of the peace conference and signs the treaties, the outcome is the confirmation of the emergence of a new Austria from the Treaty of Versailles in June, which respects strictly the independence of Austria and recognizes the complete independence of the Czechoslovak state, to the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in September, which essentially establishes the Austria whose outline we would recognize on the map today as it is represented in this embassy. And Wilson, one of the figures behind the recognition of this transformation of imperial space. Wilson was a very popular figure in some parts of the post-Habsburg Empire in the 1920s, much more so in Czechoslovakia than in Hungary. His statue went up opposite the Prague train station in the late 1920s and stayed there until 1939 when it was taken down by the Nazis, kept down during the communist period, and didn't go up again until 2011 was Wilson back on his pedestal, right around the same moment that Wilson began to be removed from the pedestal figuratively in the United States of America as his reputation began to be reevaluated. We could talk more about that. I want to focus on this Prague train station for a moment, which was Originally the Franz Josef station, it was created in its Jugendstil secession form in 1909 and became the Woodrow Wilson station in 1918. Wilson thus replacing the Kaiser Franz Josef in the naming of the train station. And I want to use this as the pivot to shift this lecture to the subject of the Habsburg dynasty. 2 years later, after the creation of the Jugendstil train station in 1911, Franz Josef, you can see him. I'm very bad at using the pointer. There he is. Can you see him on the right of the photograph? Watched the marriage of his grandnephew, Archduke Karl, to Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma in what was the great imperial marriage of the early 20th century, Karl being second in line for succession to the Habsburg crowns. During that very same year, Richard Strauss, the composer, and the Austrian-Viennese poet, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, began to plan out their next opera. In 1911 was the year of Der Rosenkavalier. They were looking for something to follow up on their biggest hit ever, and they imagined an opera about an imaginary emperor and empress, fairy tale figures, either from the remote past or perhaps from the imminent future. And what I want to do a little bit for the rest of this lecture is think about the real last emperor and empress, who you're looking at there on the left, alongside of the imaginary emperor and empress whom Strauss and Hofmannsthal are dreaming up at the same moment that Karl and Zita get married. Hofmannsthal writes in 1911 to Strauss, if we wanted once again to work on something big, it would have to have strong and colorful action. I have something quite definite in mind, which fascinates me very much. It's a Zaubermärchen in which two men and two women encounter one another. It will be an emperor and an empress, and a dyer and his wife, a Färber and a Färberin will be the two couples, and it will become one of their masterpieces, Die Frau ohne Schatten. As a Zaubermärchen, it's meant specifically to reference Mozart's Zauberflöte, which would have been the greatest of the Märchenopern up to that point, and they take it explicitly as a model. Die Zauberflöte is about the testing of a young prince who could be a Habsburg prince, and Die Frau ohne Schatten is about the testing of a young emperor and empress to discover whether in their humanity they are worthy to rule. I'm going to give you a 1-minute summary of the very complicated plot of this opera. At the very beginning of Act 1, look to the left, a magical falcon appears to the fairy tale empress, who is a spirit, not a human, and tells her that unless she can acquire a human shadow in 3 days, a human shadow that will allow her to bear human children, her husband, the emperor, will be turned to stone. So, assisted by her demonic nurse, whom you see on the right in black, she descends to the world of the lowly dyer, the Färber, in order to steal his wife's shadow. Act 2, the nurse is about the nurse tempting the dyer's wife to give up her shadow to the empress, while the empress begins to wonder whether this is really the right thing for her to do, to steal another woman's shadow. Act 3, the empress decides that she must renounce the shadow of the other woman and thereby truly proves her humanity. Her husband, who has been turned to stone, the emperor, is restored to life, and the two couples celebrate a happy ending in which they are reconciled to each other, and the emperor and empress are reconciled to the subjects whom they rule. It's an empire that lives happily ever after, because it's a fairy tale empire. The Habsburg Empire, of course, does not live happily ever after in history. Hofmannsthal is someone you may know. He's one of the great names in Austrian literature. He's discovered as a child genius when he's 17 years old in 1891. We have Schnitzler quoted here describing Hofmannsthal at the age of 17 appearing in his short trousers. We're astonished, almost frightened. We had never heard verses of such perfection, such faultless plasticity, such musical feeling from any living being, right? one of the great lyric poets of the German language when he's still a teenager. By the time he's in his 20s, he's already having a language crisis, which he describes in the Lord Chandos letter. He gives up writing lyric poetry forever, turns to drama and librettos, has a huge hit with Strauss in Der Rosenkavalier, and much later, right after the war, will found the Salzburg Festival, will be one of the founders of the Salzburg Festival in the new Republic of Austria. Hofmannsthal belongs to the world that we think of as the world of fin de siècle Vienna, dominated by geniuses like Sigmund Freud, Gustav Klimt, and Gustav Mahler, all of whom in different ways might have something to say about die Frau ohne Schatten, but I'm going to put that aside for the moment and remind you that Vienna was the capital of an empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which also included fairy tale peoples of a fairy tale exoticism. Here I've showed you on the left the Bosnian Muslims who seem to come out of the oriental world of die Frau ohne Schatten, and on the right the Galician Jews, whom to others seem to come out of an Eastern and Oriental world within the borders of the Habsburg Monarchy. The whole point of this lecture, I'm going to give you the argument right now before I proceed any further, is that at the moment they think of this opera in 1911, Europe is still a world of empires. In Austria-Hungary, in Germany, in Russia. Emperors and empresses dominate the game in Eastern and Central Europe. By the time the opera is finally presented in 1919, on the other side of the war, the empresses and empresses are pretty much gone. And empresses have begun to seem, as they do to us today, like fairy tale figures, which is precisely the form in which Strauss and Hofmannsthal present them in the opera. That is to say, the lecture is going to be about the ways in which figures who are real and politically meaningful on one side of World War I are translated into the realm of fairy tale culture on the other side of World War I. Karl and Zita begin their romance at Františkove Lázně, the Czech spa town within the Habsburg Monarchy in 1909. They've known each other since children. They belong to a select circle of very royal families. But the romance begins here where Zita is, I think, 16 or 17 years old. If we were looking at this lovely spa town, the people you are looking at on the right are my great-grandparents, also there in the early 20th century. My great-grandparents who were subjects of Karl and Zita when they reigned from 1916 until 1918. My grandfather had, I was just telling someone that had a leather shop in the Leopoldstadt in the early 20th. My great-grandfather had a leather shop in the Leopoldstadt in the early 20th century. I'm going to follow an implicit parallelism between the stories of Karl and Zita and the stories of the fairy tale emperor and empress, as designed here by Alfred Roller, the great Secession designer. But first I want to remind you that Hofmannsthal is someone who thinks hard and deeply about empires and what they mean. 1913, we must admit to each other, he writes to his friend Leopold von Andrian, who is in the Habsburg diplomatic service. We have a homeland but no fatherland, in place of which we have only a ghost. It is bitter to think we may at some point have to sacrifice the blood of our children for this ghost. Not that it would be desirable or bearable for me to contemplate the falling apart of this old empire, but for a mere existence without any idea, without any direction beyond today and the next day. In contrast, the Metternich epoch had a soul, because reactionary or not, it served an idea. What about us? I want to emphasize that while Hofmannsthal is writing this libretto, he's thinking about ideas of empire and what it is that makes empires legitimate and meaningful. It's not only a fairy tale. Very focused on the figure of the Empress at its center. He tells us that of the 5 main characters, the Emperor is the least prominent. His fairy tale fate of being turned to stone is his most striking feature. He is the hunter and lover. The Empress, however, much more important. She has a threefold nature, part animal, part human, and part spirit. And Hofmannsthal reminds Strauss that at the beginning, the humanity is missing. To inquire this humanity, that's the meaning of the whole work. even in the music. The one thing you must never forget, the Empress is the main figure and her destiny the pivot of the whole opera. Hofmannsthal's trying to think through a political theology of empire in this fairy tale. Strauss listens to him and tries to compose at the beginning an empress who is not fully human, an empress who is accompanied by a solo violin as she wakes up, who sings like a bird, not quite human, accompanied by harps. Bird-like. Falcon appears to her in this very first scene, and you can see accompanied just by the oboe and the clarinet in this unreal world that the Empress is living in, warns her that if she casts no shadow, the emperor must turn to stone. And she sings a magical duet with the falcon. There's the oboe and the clarinet. Strauss is trying to give Hofmannsthal a world that isn't human yet. Warned by the falcon, the Empress decides that she must descend into the human world from the terrace of her imperial palace to the dwelling place of the humble dyer in search of a shadow. And when she does that, Strauss brings in the whole orchestra, right? You can see, I mean, part of the drama of this work is there are two orchestras. There's a not quite human orchestra for the world of the emperor and empress, who must be humanized by the fully human orchestra of the world down below. And Strauss and Hofmannsthal work it out pretty carefully together. The instruments enter as the empress announces that a new day is dawning. Ein Tag bricht an, right? Ein Menschentag, as they descend into the abyss. And there's the orchestra, finally. There are many challenges to being human, one of which, for the Empress, will be singing over the full Straussian orchestra, which she doesn't have to do when she's up in the imperial palace. When you get to the human world, the whole percussion section enters into the world of the dyer. I do want to point out to you that dyers are real in the world of the early 20th century. There's an advertisement for a Färberei, and the Färberei would have been right next to the leather shop of my great-grandfather in the Leopoldstadt, because leather dealers worked closely with dyers. Dyers are not only fairy tale figures in the world of the early 20th century. The empire is called the Empire of the Southeastern Islands, but we would be able to recognize these imperial figures. An emperor who is turned to stone. Franz Josef was turned to stone in his own lifetime. The commemorative stone busts of Franz Josef were everywhere on the occasion of his jubilees. The emperor was a hunter and a lover. The Habsburg were famous hunters, and no one more so than Archduke Franz Ferdinand. There we see him with an elephant that he killed in Sri Lanka. These were figures who, though composed in a fairy tale, are obviously composed with reference to certain real features of the Habsburg dynasty. And when Stefan Zweig writes after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand about the character of Franz Ferdinand, it's clear that the human characteristics of the family are really important to writers and poets. Franz Ferdinand lacked everything that counts for real popularity. Amiability, personal charm. He had no sense for music, no sense of humor. This is after his assassination. Stefan Zweig is writing this. He and his wife were surrounded by an icy air. There were many on that day in Austria who secretly sighed with relief that this heir of the aged emperor had been removed in favor of the much more beloved young Archduke Karl. A lot of hopes and fantasies invested in the young Archduke Karl. Hofmannsthal writes, "I would like to draw all your attention to the Empress," he writes to Strauss. "She has not much libretto text in Act 2, and yet is actually the most important figure in the opera." And then down below, there's always a spiritual light coming from her, and the stages on her road to humanity are marked as if by luminous flames. I want to, again, focus on this as a political theology, but what I really want you to focus on is the date of this letter, 25th of July, 1914. This is 1 week before the outbreak of World War I, and Hofmannsthal is obsessing over the character of his fairy tale Empress. Weird, right, that this is what is most on his mind at that moment. Strauss, as soon as Hofmannsthal is called up for service, writes to Madame Hofmannsthal, "Hugo has the damn duty not to die for the fatherland before I have my third act," which I hope will bring him more honor than a beautiful obituary in the Neue Freie Presse. Hofmannsthal is transferred to desk service, but the war almost immediately begins to mark the score of this opera. Strauss is just concluding the piano music, the piano score for Act 1 as the war begins. He writes at the end of the score, "Hail to our brave troops, hail to our great German fatherland." It's actually written on the score. And the beautiful music of the Night Watchman, which I was just discussing with Gary, is already marked by the spirit of the war. It's a solemn hymn to the dead, right? It's "You spouses who lie lovingly in each other's arms, you are the bridge that extends over the abyss by which the dead return to life." Except there really are dead already by the moment Strauss is composing this in August of 1914. It becomes a solemn hymn to the dead. You see, the trumpets and the trombones are pianissimo, triple P. Right? It's so solemn and reverential, the hymn. After this war, writes Hofmannsthal, first of all, in Germany, there will be felt a quite definite atmosphere with definite demands regarding everything, and especially the arts. Die Frau ohne Schatten, because of its theme and execution, may appear exceptionally good and honorable in this atmosphere. He's already, in 1915, scheduled this opera for the end of the war. Strauss writes, "I'm fresh, well-rested, full of energy, Taten, Frau. Why are you letting your head hang low? You can rely on Germany. But as for politics, we should try to consider it a little from a distance. Leave the work to those it concerns. Only work can comfort us. Only work can help us achieve victory. Please send me soon what is finished of Act 3, if possible, the first half." Strauss lets us know that this work, which is being reserved for the end of the war, is being reserved for a German-Austrian victory in the war. That's what it's supposed to mark for the two of them. And of course, we know that's not how the war is going to end. The opera is going to appear at a quite different moment from the one that they anticipate. Now, many Germans and Austrians, besides Hofmannsthal, go into wartime service. Schoenberg with some rather strong ideas about German music. Kokoschka is actually wounded in combat. Archduke Karl is an officer in the Habsburg army and joins the troops at the front, although he also participates in the command. Zita goes to live with Franz Josef at Schönbrunn during the war, where Popular ballads are being composed in honor of Franz Josef, as if he were a statue made of stone around whom one could celebrate patriotism.
Herr, macht ihr doch das Herz nicht schwer, dass sie so einen Kaiser hat. Sie ist die Wiener Stadt. Was wir können, wollen wir tun. Lasst ihr bisser Zeit zum Ruhen. Wir wird nur der Euder Herr von Schönbrunn.
So popular operetta is also thinking about these imperial figures as Strauss and Hofmannsthal are in the world of opera, because they're composing right through the war. In April of 1915, they actually get together in spite of wartime obstacles so that Strauss can play the piano score for Hofmannsthal of the first two acts. And he tells Strauss, perhaps you could take your stroll in the Schönbrunn gardens beforehand. I love this because Zita is there at Schönbrunn, and it's possible that Strauss could have caught a glimpse of the real future Empress just before sitting down to play the piano score and introducing Hofmannsthal to the operatic fairy tale Empress. He would have concluded Act Two, and this would have been very difficult at the piano, to represent the seven voices of the concluding septet against the full orchestra. But I would want to emphasize that the Kaiserin, who has very little text in Act Two, we've been told, dominates the septet with the word Blut on a high A flat, right? This is wartime composition. Franz Josef dies at the end of 1916, and Karl and Zita become the last Emperor and Empress of Austria, King and Queen of Hungary. You see them in their Hungarian coronation robes there. Zita says, our life changed now completely, a monstrous burden transferred to the emperor. My life also changed a lot as the successor of Empress Elizabeth, assassinated in 1898, so revered by the people, especially the Hungarians. Situation for me, not so easy. I had a great love for the people engraved upon my heart and for all those who suffered, all the more so now that I had become the mother of the country, Landesmutter. The difficulties and hardships of the people weighed upon us. I want to emphasize here that Zita is thinking of herself a little bit like the fairy tale Empress in the opera, someone who needs to understand human suffering in order to humanize herself and connect with the people of her realm. There you see her meeting the troops, right, during the war. It's part of humanizing the Empress in an age of war. Her birthday in 1917 becomes Kaiserin Zita Kindertag, and no one less than Erich Wolfgang Korngold, another teenage genius, produces a Kaiserin Zita hymn for the occasion to celebrate her. Strauss and Hofmannsthal are not the only ones thinking operatically about Zita at this moment. Their greatest gesture, Karl and Zita, their greatest non-achievement is their effort to make peace during the war. Karl reaches out first to Clemenceau, and then to Wilson in Washington. This is where Wilson comes back into this lecture in an attempt to see if he can negotiate a separate peace without reference to Germany at this moment in 1917 and 1918. Wilson, in his 14 points at the beginning of 1918, has not yet condemned the Austro-Hungary to oblivion, right? He only asks that the nations who make up Austria-Hungary should have their autonomous development safeguarded. George Herron is his agent in Switzerland, meets with Lamache in February of 1918. Herron reports that the emperor, urged on by the empress, and Zita is deeply involved in this, was getting more and more anxious for a change. They wanted to find some way of getting a confidential message to President Wilson that would not be known by Germany. But Herron warns that across the Golden Bridge between Vienna and Washington, it seems to me that Austria wouldn't be walking into the future, but America would be walking into the past. Interesting to think about here at the Austrian Embassy in Washington. These discussions are blown up in April 1918 by the Prince Sixtus affair. This was the attempted mediation by Zita's brother, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma. And by May 1918, the American Secretary of State is writing to Wilson, should we or should we not favor the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire into its component parts, the fateful decision that lies in front of them. On November 11th, at the end of the war, Karl must renounce all participation in government affairs as the empire is in fact begins to be dissolved into its component parts. He does not abdicate, and for that reason, he must leave Austria with Zita in 1919. Stefan Zweig reports again, at last came the bell that announces the approach of a train from the Austrian side. He's on the Austrian-Swiss border. Slowly, majestically, the train rolled near. Then I recognized behind the plate glass window Emperor Karl, the last emperor of Austria, standing with his black-clad wife, Empress Zita. I was startled. The last emperor of Austria, heir of the Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled for 700 years, was forsaking his realm. Zita records the same moment. We could not console ourselves for having had to take leave of our homeland, but we hoped it would not last too long, that we would soon be able to return to our dear homeland. Of course, she could not return to her dear homeland because her homeland was Austria-Hungary and it no longer existed in 1919. What I want to emphasize here, coming back again to the central theme of this lecture, the moment in 1919 when Karl and Zita are on a train that is taking them out of Austria is the moment when their counterparts, the fictional fairy tale operatic emperor and empress, will step onto the stage of the opera house in 1919, enacting what will be increasingly be seen as the fairy tale personae of emperors and empresses. There's the Opera House in Vienna where the work appears, now the capital of the new Republic of Austria, as we recognize it here in the embassy. It's a terrible moment for a great premiere. Zweig tells us that the Philharmonic players were like gray shadows in their shabby dress suits, undernourished and exhausted by many privations. The audience, too, seemed to be ghosts in a theater which had become ghostly. And Karl Renner, the chancellor, says, I believe this winter we will reach the lowest point of our poverty, the lowest point of our helplessness. There are still terrible things that lie before us. That he says that on October 10th, 1919, which is the exact date of the world premiere of Die Frau ohne Schatten at the Vienna Opera. So when Barak the dyer sings about how he would struggle if only he had children, to be able to feed his children and spare them hunger, it's real and meaningful in the context of autumn and winter of 1919. Gib du mir Kinder. The pathos is not only in the musical part, but in the circumstances in which it's being sung in 1919. Here are Strauss and Hofmannsthal with Roller, the designer, ready to recreate an imperial world which has just vanished from the political scene. Splendid, wasn't it? They've got a fantastic cast. The famous Maria Jeritza as the Empress, the famous Lotte Lehmann, she will be more famous, right? This is still earlier in his career, as the Färberin, the dyer's wife. Jeritza wears the hair of the Kaiserin Elizabeth, who was assassinated in 1898. Look at it, it's her trademark all the way down her back. Roller puts it on the design for the Empress, and Jeritza wears it as a wig at the premiere. Again, to emphasize that these roles are created with reference to real historical figures. The way you've created the emperor in music, writes Hofmannsthal, gives me the most definite idea for how to deal with this figure in the third act. After he's awakened from his petrifaction, turned to stone, He must have his aria, his completely different Gralserzählung. The Gralserzählung is the aria from Wagner's Lohengrin in Fernem Land, in which Lohengrin appears as a salvific, redemptive figure in the third act. And clearly, Hofmannsthal wants the emperor in the opera to appear as a redemptive figure in just the same way. And Strauss takes him very seriously. Lohengrin's Infernum Land is in A major. The emperor is going to wake up from petrifaction in A major. The Norwegian tenor, Karl Østvig, also sang Lohengrin. It was one of his trademark roles. He's also just the same age as Kaiser Karl, the figure whom we might think of him in relation to. Here's his Gralserzählung. He wakes up slowly, right? Strauss begins to think of a magical music for a figure being returned from paralysis, something that must have been real and meaningful in the post-war moment that they were composing this work, the return from paralysis. It's uncanny, it's disturbing. The dead man shall rise out of the tomb of his own body. How terrifying that line must have been in 1919. He references the unborn children, who are one of the controversial points in this opera, because the phrase unborn is one that in the later 20th century became part of the debate over reproductive rights in America especially. Hofmannsthal and Strauss are not thinking of that at all. When they think about the unborn children, they are thinking about what we would call posterity, the future. They're imagining fairy tale putti, winged cherubs who hover between our world and another world. Hofmannsthal sees them bringing a redemptive message to mankind following the war. The first passages, Hört, wir wollen sagen, Vater, I imagine is so tonally marvelous that it does not matter whether one understands them or not, as if birds were suddenly speaking from the sky, the sound more important than the sense. In the first passage, the alienating, enchanting sound miracle, das befremdlich entzückende Klangwunder, must predominate. And Strauss tries to do it for him, to give him the sound miracle. You can hear the celeste and the flutes trilling. The Austrian poet Georg Trakl, who died at the beginning of the war, wrote a poem in which he refers to the hot flame of the spirit nourishes today tremendous grief, the unborn descendants, by whom he means the descendants of the soldiers who died, the children they would never have. Again, I want to emphasize that the idea of the unborn carries a mystical significance for this generation of the war, including for Hofmannsthal, who writes about the abyss by which the dead return to life through the birth of new children. The Kaiserin looks up and recognizes them as cherubim as they descend towards her. I would play more music for you if I had time, but I don't. I would play more music for you from the figure of Barak the dyer and his wife, because they are great audience favorites. They are ordinary Viennese people, as Strauss and Hofmannsthal conceive them. And the baritone who sings the role of Barak is a great favorite with the public when the work is first produced. They celebrate at the end, with Barak leading the celebration. Nun will ich jubeln, wie keiner gejubelt. But what a moment for celebration, right? It's a moment of deep impoverishment. There are post-war tenements. It's a moment of class warfare, as you're looking at the poster there in the middle. The reconciliation and harmony that Strauss and Hofmannsthal wanted. They wrote a C major quartet that's supposed to make you think of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and its final movement comes at just the wrong moment to make its mark. Yet it reminds one of the glorious days of Gustav Mahler, says one critic, and there must be an invincible strength in the Austrian and the Viennese character, devastated in the most terrible of wars, mutilated, robbed of its riches, hungering, freezing, going blind. This city can still make music like no other city. Point of pride. Hofmannsthal in the post-war period will build on that sense of pride as he creates the Salzburg Festival. Strauss in 1920 is in Rio de Janeiro, thinking about Die Frau ohne Schatten. He writes to Hofmannsthal, for its fairy tale splendor, I can only compare Rio to the empire of the Eastern Islands, the empire of Die Frau ohne Schatten, where I believe myself to be transplanted every day when I look out over the bay from our roof terrace. The opera begins on the imperial roof terrace. I've often thought of you and wished you were here so you could see your beautiful poetic dream become a reality. Karl and Zita are also nostalgic for their empire. They would like to return to their empire too. They try twice in 1921 to return to Hungary, and they end up being banished to Madeira, where Karl dies young in 1922. But he has his Gralserzählung. He's beatified by the Roman Catholic Church in 2004. Some 8 decades later, like the fairy tale emperor, his Gralserzählung, while Zita raises the 8 children, first in Spain, then in Belgium, and then the concluding part of my lecture is about Zita in America, because in 1940, Zita comes to America, fleeing from Hitler's Europe on the Dixie Clipper from Lisbon to New York. Zita is Portuguese royalty on the side of her mother, Bourbon Parma royalty on the side of her father. There she is, arriving at LaGuardia with her daughter, the Archduchess Elizabeth, in 1940. There's her alien registration card, which I found in the archives. It's here in Washington, in which Zita signs herself Zita, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, on her alien registration card. Nice way to be able to sign your card. Here's her arrival in America. It's the moment of the Great World's Fair in New York, 1939. The countries that Zita ruled over, right? They have their pavilions. Czechoslovakia, which no longer exists by 1940. Hungary, and Yugoslavia, right? All of these countries are about to be absorbed into the maelstrom of Hitler's Europe. But there's Zita's realm set up as pavilions in Queens in the World's Fair. She's invited to the World's Fair. Instead, she's settled in the little town, appropriately Royalston, in Massachusetts. She will spend some time in Tuxedo Park, north of New York City, about 50 miles to the northwest, and sometime in Quebec, which is more comfortably Catholic for Zita. There you have a Christmas card she sends from Quebec in 1940 with a picture of the Hofburg on it, even though she is writing from Quebec. The person who is her great patron in America is a Wall Street investment banker named Calvin Bullock. He collects Napoleonic memorabilia, including these prints and watercolors of the Empress Josephine. In 1940, he's collecting real empresses. He's collected Zita in 1940, puts her in his home in Royalston, Mass. A lot of publicity about an empress in Royalston, Mass. New York Times. A sturdy Massachusetts state trooper drives up and says, "How's it going, Frank?" to another trooper, who asks how the Red Sox came out and drives away. It has been so since mid-July, when Zita, one-time mistress of 50 million subjects, came to this peaceful New England village as a refugee. Whether she's following the career of Ted Williams, we do not know. It's peaceful here, says Zita. These hills and mountains remind me of the Austrian landscape. But there's no Catholic church in Royalston. She has to go to a nearby town to go to church. There are other Austrian refugees in America. Here are the Trapp family singers who, like Zita, represent Austria in exile. Captain von Trapp, of course, was her subject during World War I. Those are my grandparents with my mother, Austrian Jews who also emigrated to New York in 1940 at the very same time that Zita arrived. My grandparents were also Zita's subjects. Probably some of your grandparents were too, if you came from the lands of the Habsburg Empire. I just want to remind you that emperors and empresses were real to our grandparents. My grandparents were born as subjects of emperors and empresses. Rules for Refugees from Life magazine, published with that picture of Zita looking out the window. Refugees should remember they're nothing special. Broadly speaking, all U.S. citizens except Indians who do not count are either refugees or descendants of refugees. It would be very tasteless humor today, wouldn't it? Celebrated refugees must learn U.S. manners and customs. They should not suggest to natives that civilized people take 3 hours for lunch, that what the U.S. needs is art and culture, such as only Europeans can contribute, and that Americans do not really know how to live. So arch, right? So weird in retrospect, given our understanding of refugees from Nazi Europe. Refugees should remember that Americans' nerves are on edge. They must not band together in little swarms, chattering and squealing in their foreign bird talk. And then, aimed especially at Austrians, at all costs let those refugees and imitation refugees who insist on sliding in the snow in Tyrolean costume stop yodeling. Right? I think Zita was probably not yodeling. However, life reminds us that she has never let Europe or her children forget their Habsburg claim to the throne. She goes to Hyde Park to remind Roosevelt of that in September 1940, of the Habsburg claim to the throne. She's lobbying for a Habsburg restoration following World War II. About President Wilson, they did not speak, says Archduchess Elizabeth. Interesting to me. Wilson, who was certainly very complicit in the dissolution of her empire. She goes to the White House in 1943. Elizabeth tells us that even for the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, it meant something quite extraordinary to receive Empress and Queen Zita, who participated in the small miracle of persuading even Frau Roosevelt of the necessity of a free and independent Austria. When Roosevelt goes to Quebec to meet with Churchill in 1944, Zita is there. I want to tell you, she writes to Roosevelt, how much I enjoyed talking to you and how grateful I am for the words of encouragement, for your promise to act to safeguard the lives of the Hungarians and Austrians from the communist danger. Your words have taken a heavy burden off my heart. May God help and protect you, dear Mr. President, in this noble task, which will secure you the undying friendship and gratitude of my countries. With kindest regard to Mrs. Roosevelt. I like the plural, my countries, here. And she goes to Washington in 1948 to speak to the Women's National Democratic Club. The Archduchess Elizabeth reports, I remember how warmly the women greeted my mother at her entrance. After all, it meant something to them. Just the fact there was a genuine empress sitting across from them and one who spoke such charming English. I saw at the beginning the burning curiosity with which they marveled at the empress and queen, the miraculous being from another world, how they gradually forgot the empress and saw more and more only the mother fighting for her children, for millions of disenfranchised, hungry, battered human children. She's a Wunderwesen right here. I want to emphasize here the convergence between the real-life Zita and the fairy tale empress of the opera, who is a Wunderwesen in the conception of the fairy tale, also deeply preoccupied with the lives of children. The operatic empress, Maria Theresa, she's in America too. She's singing her great roles on the stage of the Met, Turandot, Carmen, Tosca, never die Frau ohne Schatten. She has her Time magazine cover in the 1920s, and she dies in New Jersey in 1982. I was growing up in New Jersey while she was living there. Lotte Lehmann, the first dyer's wife, has her Time magazine cover as well, and her great role as the Marschallin in Der Rosenkavalier. She dies in Santa Barbara in 1976. The opera has a strange history. It means different things at different moments. When it's performed in Rome in 1938, it reflects the friendship between Mussolini and Austro-fascism. It's a collaboratively negotiated production. By the time it comes to La Scala in 1940, it's about the Axis alliance between Mussolini and Hitler. But its great moment comes after the war, with the rebuilding of the Vienna Opera House in 1955, at the moment of the State Treaty. The opera emerges as a huge hit, with its message of redemption finally just right for the post-World War II moment. And from Vienna in 1955, it goes all over the world, coming to the New World, first to San Francisco and then to New York in 1966. Zita lives to the age of 96 and dies in 1989. When she died, and I saw that, I thought, didn't she die decades ago? It seemed amazing that a figure could have survived from so many years, 70 years after she ceased to rule, right, into a completely different epoch, through the whole Cold War, dying as the Cold War was ending. And 20 years later, I got this message, which brought Zita into my life. Dear Professor Wolff, you will probably be surprised to receive that email. I am actually looking for an American historian who could collaborate for searching in North America on the servant of God, Her Majesty Empress and Queen Zita. You probably know that the church has beatified the Blessed Emperor Charles in 2004. Now we are beginning the process for her, so that the holiness of this venerable couple may be acknowledged and given to the faithful as an example. I am the legitimately constituted postulator of this cause of beatification and canonization. My first thought was that one of my friends was playing a joke on me. Actually, I thought it could be Peter who was doing it. But it actually turned out to be a real thing, the cause of the beatification of Empress Zita, and I participated in it for quite a number of years, working in the American archives to compile the necessary information that the Vatican required. That's why I have her alien registration card and can show it to you. John Paul II was very devoted to Zita. When she went to visit him in the Vatican in the 1980s, very old, 90 years old, she kneeled down before the Pope, and he said, "Rise up, Empress of my father." Again, to remind you that for many people, including John Paul, emperors and empresses are real figures in their family history. She was the empress of his father, as she was the empress of my grandfather. If you were in Oklahoma last week, you could have attended a symposium that was dedicated to discussing the cause for the beatification of the Empress Zita. The cause is ongoing. So what I'm interested in then, as I conclude, is how we get from the world of 1911, where emperors and empresses are real and ruling from their thrones, often in constitutional circumstances, like Franz Josef or Karl and Zita, but real political figures, to the post-Wilsonian world of Die Frau and Schatten, in which they're fairy tales. And what is beatification but the ultimate fairy tale status? Karl and Wilson both died in the early 20s. Both were beatified in a sense, and Wilson has since been demonized, right, in the period that followed. Hofmannsthal died in 1929, Strauss in 1949, and there's all the difference in the world for the way we think about their careers in the difference between those two dates. Zita lived till 1989, and the opera has survived to be performed for its centennial in Vienna in 2019, just on the eve of the pandemic. And we'll have a spectacular production in San Francisco in about 2 weeks, where it's been chosen to mark the centennial of the San Francisco Opera Company. So still a festival opera that's reserved for festival moments. The very last thing I want to say to you is that at Zita's funeral in Vienna in 1989, the Vienna Boys Choir sang. Of course they did. They had to. How could they not? After singing in Zita's funeral in that same year, they move into the recording studio with the Vienna Symphony, where they begin making the first digital recording of Die Frau ohne Schatten, singing the parts of the unborn children, the chorus that I just played for you, the sound wonder miracle that Hofmannsthal imagined as Die Frau ohne Schatten entered the digital age in 1989. So think about this for a moment, right? The Vienna Boys Choir moving from singing for the real Empress at her funeral to the studio where they sing for the fairy tale Empress in the opera. And are we really sure which is which? Thank you.